Welcome to the Holy Post. Democrats are pro-choice and Republicans are pro-life, right? A closer look at the data says that in a post-Roe America, the abortion issue is getting a lot more complicated. Then I talked to Old Testament professor M. Daniel Carroll about a theology of immigration. He says that before Christians adopt a political policy about immigration, they first need a biblical vision of immigrants themselves. All of that, plus Smashing Pumpkin records. Before we jump in, throughout November we've decided to do a special focus on the issue of immigration. Beyond today's interview with Dr. Carroll, we're also launching a new Holy Post explainer video about the history of America's immigration policy and the role of racism over the last century. So be sure to check that out at our website or on YouTube. Then, on this coming Monday night, November 13th at 8 p.m. Central, Holy Post Plus subscribers can join me, Caitlin, and Holy Post pundit Dr. Carmen Imes for a live stream as we discuss our recent border trip with World Relief to Tijuana, Mexico. You'll hear what we learned about the border crisis from churches on both sides of the wall, our conversation with U.S. border agents, and from people seeking asylum. To be a part of all of that and the live stream, be sure to sign up for Holy Post Plus by visiting holypost.com today. Okay, here's episode 590.
Hey there, this is Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hello, Phil.
Hi. I sound so much more excited to see you than you sound to see me.
Well, I see other people all the time and you don't. You're like in your hovel writing someplace, and so I think you're excited to be out in the real world,
I see.
Digitally.
So I'm the hobbit that just came out of a long winter's nap, and I'm excited that there are still people out here. And we have a surprise guest. We have Jamie Ivey. Hi, Jamie Ivey.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. Who's
Was
Jamie
that good?
Ivey? Who's Jamie Ivey? She's a Holy Post pundit, but she is also an author, speaker, podcaster, host of the Happy Hour podcast, married to Aaron, who's pastor of worship and creativity at Austin Stone Community Church
That's
Austin, Texas, correct?
Yes, it is.
That Austin. We'll have to talk about
That
that.
Austin. The best Austin. Are there other ones? I'm sure there's other ones.
I'm sure that, there's Austin, Minnesota, which is tiny. Then we drive by it if you go to, it's somewhere on the way to Okoboji, their Bible conference. Have you ever been to Okoboji Lakes Bible and Missionary Conference, Jamie Ivey?
I feel like that was a name you just made up, Okoboji, but I'm going to believe you.
That's a good guess, but you're wrong. Okay, now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
This episode of the Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. In my 50 years on this earth, life has thrown me more than a few curveballs. The loss of a dream, rough spots in relationships, challenges in parenting. Even though friends and family and strangers on Facebook are always ready with advice, my wife Lisa and I have found it tremendously helpful to sit down with a professional therapist. And you can too. Faithful Counseling can help you find a therapist that works for you. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, it's easy and free to change counselors until you find the right fit. Plus, it's more affordable than traditional in-office counseling, and financial aid is available. Whether you're struggling with family conflicts, trauma, anxiety, stress, or depression, Faithful Counseling can match you with a Christian therapist who can help. Continue growing into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. So Caitlin's not around, so we're rotating in some pundits. We're having fun. We reached out to some Holy Post pundits to say, would you like to sit in on the show? And Jamie was brave enough to raise her little hand and say, how about me?
I'm just here to see like how this actually goes down. You know what?
I'm a listener. I don't
know, I'm a pundit, but I just want to see behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Skye, what does she need to know?
So I will report back to everybody.
What does she need to know, Skye?
What does she need to know? I don't know. I don't think there's that much behind the curtain.
No.
Is there?
Oh, no. No, that's exactly what we want people to believe. No.
Yeah.
There's nothing behind the curtain. Don't even bother looking behind the curtain, Jamie, because there's nothing there.
Okay.
Or in that
I will
closet over
I will
there.
tell that at the end. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Man floats down the Missouri River in a pumpkin to break world record. Now, I don't know if you were listening a year ago, Jamie Ivey, because you do listen to the podcast, right?
I'm a faithful listener of the podcast. Yes.
Yeah. Because you wouldn't be on if you weren't. We just don't, people that don't listen to the podcast, it's like they don't exist as far as we can't even see them.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
A year ago, I talked about, and a few weeks ago, we talked about how every story that starts with Nebraska man is going to be a great story. Because one of those stories was the Nebraska man who modified his car so he could ride around with his 4,000-pound bull in the passenger seat.
Yes, I remember that.
Another one
Yes.
was the guy who went midnight bike riding with his parrot and was hit by a deer and woke up with his parrot pecking on his face, either to wake him or eat him.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, we're not sure. But another one a year ago was a Nebraska man who set the world record, Guinness certified record for floating on a river in a pumpkin. And he no longer holds the record. As of last month, he no longer holds a record because Steve Cuny, who is not a Nebraska man, this is the sad part of the story.
Where's he from?
Missouri. He's a Missouri man.
Oh, not far.
He spent 11 hours floating down the Missouri River in a 1,200-pound pumpkin.
I can't even figure out what a 1,200-pound pumpkin looks like.
It looks like a regular pumpkin, but much, much bigger.
Yeah.
Jamie.
Where do you find a 1,200-pound pumpkin?
You have to grow it yourself. He grew it himself.
And how many pies can you make out of a 1,200-pound pumpkin?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's one, if you really want to dive into this, Jamie Ivey, and clearly you do, I can tell, there's one breed of pumpkin that guys use. It's always guys. I don't think that women ever try to grow 1,200-pound pumpkins. It's ridiculous. If it's a ridiculous pursuit, it's probably a guy trying to do it. And there's one breed that they use, which is capable of growing extraordinarily large. And in most cases, you have to kind of hand feed them daily. So it's like taking care of a baby.
What do you mean hand feed them?
How do you hand feed
for
a
example,
pumpkin?
I don't know why I know this, but I do, because I know many things that aren't useful until a story comes up that needs it. For example, putting like almost a candle wick into the vine. You cut a little hole and put a candle wick in, and then you drop the other end of the wick into a bowl of milk. And you're actually feeding the pumpkin milk, which makes
That's really
grow.
weird.
And so you have to do that every day. So I don't know if it's milk that they're using or if they've come up with
Wow.
new pumpkin supplements when you're going for the record. But yeah, you can grow a 2,000-pound pumpkin if you know how.
I would assume in order to get a good boat pumpkin, you also have to grow it really symmetrically so that it rests evenly in the water.
Do you know what he did? Because this is smart. Because he had some smarts.
Okay, because he's not from Nebraska; he's from Missouri.
He's from
so-
Missouri.
Yeah.
Before the show me your pumpkin state, before they cut a hole in it, they floated it to see which angle would naturally
Oh, he
come to
is
the
smart.
surface. So they figured out what was the heaviest part of the pumpkin, and then they cut a hole in the opposite of that. And then he put sandbags in the bottom of it. So he actually weighed it down. So if you see a picture of Mr. Steve Cuny riding his pumpkin, he's pretty low in the water. It's a little surprisingly...
He's got ballast tanks.
Yeah, he's got ballast. He's got just Missouri River pumpkin record-breaking float. Do you see it, Jamie?
Okay, I do see it. And you guys, he has what you used to like
A kayak.
Oars?
A
Yes,
kayak
he has
paddle.
Yeah.
oars.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to just drift into things. You got to steer a little
True.
bit.
Is there some reason why he didn't go longer? Was there an accident? Did he get grounded? What happened?
Because he broke the record. He broke the record,
So he's
Skye.
done.
Because
Yeah,
the
but he
record,
could have kept going.
Okay, Skye Jitani, I'm going to be straight with you. Imagine kneeling in a pumpkin for 11 hours. Kneeling
Okay,
in a pumpkin.
Yeah,
I'm not
his
trying to take
knees were
anything away
hurting.
from his achievement. It's a great achievement. He should be celebrated for all eternity. I'm just saying, if you could go further. I didn't know if there was some reason he didn't go further than he went.
I'm going to say his knees are the reason.
His body.
Well, they could have
stop.
probably made a more ergonomic interior to the pumpkin so that his legs didn't get too fatigued.
Well, you can't move around or you're going to roll. You know, you gotta kind of find your center. Hey, Jamie, you've never been here before, so you get to do something new. Can you take this story and suggest a spiritual application?
Okay, I'm ready. This is where Skye shines, and so I'm a little nervous right now.
He does.
So I think our spiritual application would be that, you know, we don't want to, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do this, you guys. I was going to say something with going with the flow, conforming to the world, but you want to be your own self. So you may be in the river, like we're a part of the world, but you're in your pumpkin. So you're going to be different and set apart. You're not a regular boat. You're not a regular fish. You're a pumpkin boat. That's how God wants us to be, you guys. He wants us to be a little different than the world, even if we have to be in the same river.
Even if we're in a wildly inefficient vehicle.
Yes. What is Skye going to say? I see his brain working.
Skye, do you have anything better than that? Because that was pretty
No,
good.
I'm having trouble. I mean, my mind's immediately going to, of course, Jesus asleep in the back of the boat during the storm, Mark 5. But I don't know. And then there's John 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me, I will abide in you, and through me you will bear much fruit and grow giant pumpkins fed with milk. You know, maybe if our goal is to bear great fruit for God, it's just a reminder we need to stay attached to. Oh, and then Paul talks about the spiritual milk of the word, right, which grows giant pumpkins, which then can float us on the river of the world, so that
pumpkins of righteousness. Would you say?
Yeah. Oh, and the pumpkin is like an archetype of the ark, that preserved God's people through the flood.
Ooh.
Archetype.
The pumpkin, the pumpkin is big enough to preserve all of God's people through the chaos waters.
Yes.
Of destruction.
But only if it's been fed with
go.
the milk of the Spirit.
Bingo.
So that it grows to prodigious righteousness size.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Did you get that,
like
Jamie?
Got it.
Okay. We should probably move on because we can't just talk about giant pumpkins all day. Anyway, the guy who set the record last year that we talked about was interviewed by the local TV station to say, what do you think about your record being broken? And he said, I probably won't try this again, but if somebody breaks this record, I will bow down to them because they are tough. So he's admitting it's hard. It is hard to kneel in a pumpkin for a half a day.
It's nice to know he doesn't think the record was stolen or rigged.
Oh
no, he's a Nebraska man, Skye.
Well, I mean, he's capitulating magnanimously.
The honest people of the plains.
The peaceful transfer of pumpkin power. I appreciate that.
Not like Texans. What did I say? What did I say? I'm sorry,
but Jamie. I'm in Austin, remember?
Yeah, you're. Is there like a Keep Austin Weird movement like Portland? Is that a thing?
Mm-hmm. It's a saying. I don't know if it's a movement or not, but maybe it is. But we kind of like to be a little different.
And you feel like you've done your part?
I'm trying every day. It's just my goal in life.
That's good.
Keep Austin weird.
Just a little more weird. Okay, I've been wanting to talk about this for a few weeks, but we keep running out of time because other things keep coming up. Abortion, it's been more than a year. On a lighter note, abortion. It's been more than a year since the Dobbs decision, and more abortion restrictions have come into being. Skye and I got in trouble, when was it? 2 years ago, I think, for a video.
It was 2020.
Yes, okay, 3 years ago, for a video we did that suggested that the presidency may not be the key to reducing abortion rates in America, and that we were doing better just over time by letting social attitudes change and then local work, right? Remember that when you made that video, Scott?
Yeah, local and state, on the legal and government front, local and state efforts, but then on the cultural front, there was a lot Christians and pro-life folks were doing that was proving to impact abortion rates. So the argument was basically the federal government doesn't have as much power or influence over the actual on-the-ground realities of abortion, as our political rhetoric would suggest.
Yeah, what you said. What you said there. And was anyone upset at you for saying that, would you say?
Yeah, just a few people.
Yeah, it was.
What is that? What is their upsetness that they are saying that you are not viewing the right way, or what are they saying?
Because the implication was that we don't have to vote for Trump just because of abortion.
Okay, yeah.
It was an election year.
Yeah, if your only reason for voting for Donald Trump was because of abortion and thinking it was going to lower the abortion rate, the evidence suggests that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which that was a lot of people's reasoning, right, for voting for President Trump was the abortion issue.
Unless you looked at the exit polls that actually asked them on their way out of voting what their top reasons for voting the way they voted for, and for white evangelicals, abortion I think was number 5 or number 7. Mm-hmm. And immigration was number 1. We were more upset about immigrants than we were about abortions, which is kind of a frightening stat. So the New York Times has published some results, and a few others have published it from the Guttmacher Institute. Abortion rose in most states this year, new data shows. Legal abortion most likely increased in the United States in the first 6 months of the year compared with 2020. An analysis of new estimates shows as states with more permissive abortion laws absorbed patients traveling from those with bans and access to abortion pills via telemedicine continued to expand. So they're actually looking at it, and it appears that in the first 6 months of 2020, the estimate is around 465,000 abortions were recorded. And in the first 6 months of 2023, around 511,000 abortions were recorded, about 50,000 more than in 2020, which is not what was supposed to happen when we got rid of Roe.
Yeah, to be fair, I think some critique of these reports have focused on the fact that the first half of 2020 was also the beginning of the pandemic, and they wondered if this isn't quite an apples to apples comparison, which I don't know. Time will tell as more data comes in. Post Dobbs, we'll know for sure.
Yeah, well, the initial results calculated that right before and after things shut down, like the first couple of months after things shut down in some states, there was about a 7% reduction in abortion. And now that appears to have been offset by things opening up more in other states. So there are 8 states where abortions have grown more than 60% since 2020, including our own Illinois. And that is offsetting. People are traveling. And because people are traveling, so there, and this was what I said right after. In fact, I said this on the show where we talked about the Dobbs decision, that my concern was we're going to push too far and too hard and try to push for more and more restrictions, and there's going to be a backlash, and the backlash is actually going to tighten up abortion access and may turn the public against the pro-life cause, and that's kind of what we've seen. And now we have states like Illinois and California and New York that have made it easier to have access to abortion, and also Illinois is opening new clinics near the state border because so many women are traveling to Illinois for abortions, which is why abortion is up almost 70% in the state of Illinois from 2020 to 2023. So it seems like there's a limit to what you can do with legislation without changing attitudes.
Yeah, but this is also fueling more calls for national policy, a national ban on abortion or a national ban after so many weeks, because there's this acknowledgement that the state-by-state thing isn't working. The irony is, this is a lot like what you see with gun regulation. Like Illinois, for example, our state has very high regulation of firearms, but Indiana, right next door, does not, which is why most of the guns used in crimes in Illinois come from Indiana. So gun rights advocates will say, oh, gun regulation doesn't work because look at the crime in Illinois and they have all these gun laws. Well, it's hard when you can go across the border and get around those gun regulations. Same thing with abortion, only it's the opposite, where it's highly regulated in Indiana and loosely regulated in Illinois. So you have people coming from Indiana into Illinois, and all this generates, for both issues, this call for national regulation rather than just state by state.
Right. Jamie, you live in Austin, Texas, so you're in a blue dot in a red sea.
Right.
How have you seen some of this playing out around you, in your community, in your church? Where, like post-Dobbs, what's been the response that you've seen?
I think that from my community that I do life with, like my people, not my community of people that live around me per se, but my community that I do life with, I think are all saying, okay, this is really, really great that we have this, but none of us were like banking our entire lives on it. Like when this happens, then everything will be okay. And so I think we kind of are seeing it like, okay, that happened. And it's kind of this, it's been a wake-up call I felt for the church of saying, okay, now what are we going to do with that? Like, what does it look like? This is what you've been fighting for all these years. And now here it is. And now what? And I think that's what I think has been, I want to use I want to say both sides. It's been encouraging to see people say, okay, here's what we're going to do next. This is not the end all be all. And I do also say it's been a little saddening in some ways to think of some people. This is a very, very like not a lot of people feel this way, but feel like, okay, we clap in our hands, we're done, we won, the battle's over. And I don't think that's a majority of people by any way, but you do see that sometimes, I think in Austin, like you said, I live in this, liberal area in a conservative state. And I believe that people can go to New Mexico, which is right next door to us. I'm not really 100% sure on that, but I think that is true.
It's still pretty far from Austin.
Everything's far from Texas.
Yes.
But I mean, if you live on, the west side of Texas, it's not that far. But yeah, that would be a neighboring state that would send people there. I've also, this past year, talked to people who are running, pregnancy centers, and they're really positive and seem really, happy about the way that they'll be able to meet women where they are in our state because they don't have that immediate option right in front of them. So I say it's a mix of a lot of things.
And do you see churches in Texas trying to do more to step in and fill the need to help women that are in trouble?
I don't want to say yes or no because I don't think that I wouldn't be a good person to ask.
Yeah.
I haven't been looking around. So
if
I said yes, I have no data. If I have no, I have no data. Exactly.
Okay,
I feel like I go to a
understandable.
church that would be already doing things. So it wasn't as though our church went, okay, now what? Yeah. So I'm grateful for my church that is already doing things.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
I don't have the data.
Sorry, I think that's one thing we need to be reminded of. Before Dobbs, if a church was involved in caring about women who are in pregnancies that were unexpected, if they were doing that already, hopefully they're continuing to do that, maybe even ramping it up. And that's been one of the consistent positives throughout these years is people who care, churches who care. Whatever the law is, there's always going to be women who find themselves in unexpected pregnancies that need help. And that consistent response should continue regardless of what the federal or state laws are.
Okay. Our friend...
I'm interested, Phil, because I think you were going to talk about this. Maybe, I don't know, but I'm interested. I'm always curious about what does this mean for an election cycle on the other side of Dobbs.
Yeah. And that is interesting. So we've got an article from Ryan Burge, another Holy Post pundit and a wonderful guy at sorting through data, who is doing a deep dive into some recent data and wants to correct two misconceptions about abortion. He says the first misconception he wants to correct is that the most pro-life people in America are white folks, which he says is statistically not accurate. The second misconception he wants to correct, which he says the data disputes, is that pro-life folks are all economic conservatives. And the first suggested correction doesn't surprise me that much because I know how conservative, many Latino families and African American families are and what their positions are on abortion. The second one is more confusing. So let's dive in. Okay. Who is the most likely to support a total ban on abortion? Strong Republicans are. So when you say, would you support a total ban on abortion? And then you ask across the range from strong Democrat, not strong Democrat, lean Democrat, independent, lean Republican, not strong Republican, or strong Republican. Strong Republican, by far most likely to support, 50% of strong Republicans would report a national ban on all abortion. But when you go down, it's a little surprising because almost 30% of independents would support a complete ban on abortion. And almost 20% of strong Democrats would support a complete ban on abortion, which is higher than the 12% that lean Democrat that would support. So it actually, as you get more strong Democrat, you get more support for abortion bans. That's weird.
I would not have guessed it would have gone that way.
Yeah.
I would have guessed the opposite.
18% of strong Democrats are in favor of a total ban, compared to 15% of not strong Democrats and 12% of lean Democrats. And then he looks at, and this is where you can find some explanation for that, when you look at race. There's also some surprising things. The group that is easily the most likely to support a total ban on abortion is Hispanics by a significant margin at nearly 1/3. The next closest group is Black respondents. At 28% of Black respondents would support a complete ban on abortion. And then whites are even further behind at 24%. So then he crosses that. So Latinos, then Black, and then white in terms of support for a ban. Okay? Is anything there surprise you, Jamie Ivey of Austin, Texas?
Not yet.
Okay. Then he looks at ideology and says, do you consider yourself conservative or liberal or in the middle? When you look at conservative Republican, among white conservative Republicans, there's 42% support for a total ban on abortion. Among Hispanic conservative Republicans, there's a 53% support for a total ban. So even among conservatives, race makes a difference, and Latinos are much higher than white. When you look at conservative independents, so you're an independent, you're not a Republican, but you say you're a social conservative, only 33% of white conservative independents are in favor of a total ban, as opposed to 61% of Hispanic independent conservatives. That's a big gap. Wouldn't you say that's a big gap?
It is a big gap.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then a conservative Democrat, which I didn't even think was a thing. If you're a Democrat and a social conservative, if you're white, you have 34% in favor of a total ban, which is actually a point higher, so statistically identical to conservative independents. Versus if you're Latino and you're a conservative Democrat, you're 40% in favor. Okay, so his conclusion is Hispanics are just way more likely to favor an abortion ban than any other race, especially than white Americans. Then he looks at age, and there is some difference in age. Middle-aged Republicans tend to have the same view of abortion as youngest Republican voters, but Democrats are much different. Just 17% of Hispanic Democrats that are teenagers would favor an abortion ban, and then when you go up to the late 30s, it's 30%. And the same thing happens among white Democrats. A white Democrat who's 37 years old is twice as likely to support an abortion ban as a white Democrat who is 18 years old. So there's a generational difference, but not among Republicans. Interesting.
That is interesting.
So it sounds like, this is a little bit of speculation, but if you're a Hispanic who was born in the U.S. or has been in the U.S. a long time and acclimated to U.S. culture, you're less likely to support a ban on abortion than an older generation of Hispanic Americans who might be more likely to be immigrants. Is that fair to say?
I think you could speculate that, but you're entirely speculating.
I am entirely speculating, but
many,
I'm assuming there are... Yeah.
There are many Hispanic families that have been in the U.S. for
right.
80, 100, 150 years, so it's hard to...
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Right.
I'm trying to figure out why there's no age demographic difference in view on the Republican side, but there is among whatever. I don't know. There's too many variables here to get straight in my head.
But here's where it gets really weird. Oh, Jamie, do you have something?
Well, I was just saying, I just feel like I'm in like a little, like all these numbers. Like I just have the
I hope you're writing them all down. Are you writing them all down?
Is there a test at the end? So what you said was with Democrats, the older generation would less likely agree to more likely to a total ban,
favor an abortion ban than the younger generation. With Republicans, it's virtually identical. Okay, but now he digs down into beliefs about policy issues, like do you support family leave? Would you support more health care availability? Would you support debt-free college? And this is where he finds some really surprising stuff. Among the people who wanted a total ban on abortion, 67% favor debt-free college, 77% favor paid maternity leave, and 67% favor raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Okay, so
is this everybody or just Democrats?
Or Republicans?
No, this is among everyone who wants a total ban on abortion.
Okay.
That's crazy, because there's this narrative that we've all, I think, heard, that, but the people that are really the most anti-abortion only care about kids until they're born, and then they don't care anymore because it's the parents' own fault for being poor or whatever, and so we don't want to help them. And Gary's diving into stuff that disputes that. He says, I think that the typology that is emerging from this analysis is that Democrats have a few similar views of social service programs, regardless of how they feel about abortion policy. There's strong support for paid maternity leave, debt-free college, and raising the minimum wage among all Democrats, irregardless of their position on abortion. Among Republicans, though, there's a bit of a divide. Pro-life Republicans tend to be more conservative on these social programs than those who favor abortion without restriction. However, it's really important to point out that among Republicans who favor a total ban on abortion, 72% support paid maternity leave, 53% want to raise the minimum wage, and the same share want debt-free college. So very pro-life, anti-abortion Republicans are more likely to want social support for women than we've been led to believe.
Well, it sounds like the message has gotten through that those social supports have been proven to reduce abortion rates. And if you're as pro-life as this survey would make you out to be, then regardless of your political identity, you support these policies because they reduce the number of abortions. And that's good.
Yeah.
Basically, what it's saying is there aren't as many hypocrites as we've been led to believe.
Right.
That would be really encouraging.
Yes, it is encouraging.
Is it true? Do we believe Ryan's data? Jamie, do you buy it?
Well, I would like to buy it because that makes me really happy, because I think that is what we would think sometimes. Like, okay, well, the reason, after Dobbs was overturned, you're like, oh, well, now we need to work on these social services. And you would have this belief in your head that there are a bunch of people who just wanted to anti-abortion, but not like pro-women, pro-child, pro all the other things. I have been led to believe that. But my question is, do we see that actually playing out in the polls in states? Like, do we actually see that happening? Because it's one thing to say it, but do we have people who are running on platforms that are saying, hey, I'm anti-abortion and I'm pro all these social services? Like, I think people get like, oh, are you liberal now? Like, it feels like a little like,
And
do we see that happening?
Here's a theory that the people that are anti-abortion but pro more social services may not be primary voters. And so what you see in the primaries is the people that are most ideologically Republican or ideologically Democrat. And being strongly ideologically conservative, you've accepted a whole basket of positions, like government help is always bad. Poor people are poor because of choices they've made, not because of any systems. And women, I do bump into a lot of people on social media that will say women have abortions because of selfish reasons, never because of valid reasons. So those are the people that are most politically active, is my hunch. And politicians have to play to the most politically active people because they're the ones that are going to show up in the primary.
Right. And all the types identified by Ryan's research here are nuanced. They have views that don't always align with the party they vote for.
Right.
And those nuanced thinkers are not partisans to show up at a primary.
Right. I mean, African Americans are highly likely to think abortion is an evil, but also to vote Democrat for a completely different set of reasons. And I've tried to explain to people that are yelling at me that different people prioritize the issues differently when they go in to vote. And we need to understand, because your life experience is different, so you're prioritizing issues differently. And the way you view the parties is different based on your life experience and what your parents grew up experiencing. But this is just interesting. I wish there was a way to yell about this more loudly. You know?
Well, this sounds a little bit like what Justin Giboney and the folks at the AND campaign are trying to advocate for, right?
Yeah.
Let's put aside the partisan labels and let's bring together people who believe in pro-life policies and common sense restrictions on abortion, but there's no party that represents those people because each party gets some of it, but neither party gets all of it. And so we need to align ourselves with the values of our faith and the values of caring for our neighbors rather than just be in lockstep with either political party. That's a hard message to sell in America these days.
That's a really hard message to sell, which is why I also think one of the surprising data points that you mentioned was the older generations and the younger, how on the Republican was a lot the same, and on Democrats, how we saw a difference. And I just think, like, what does that say also about kids and learning and their influences and their parents and what that's a whole another conversation. I think, why are all the Republicans just marching in step with their parents, which is not right or wrong. It's just the research. But you see on the Democratic side, they're like, oh, wait, we're going to do things differently. I find that to be interesting as well, you know?
Yeah. And there is a hardening of the two-party positions over the last 30 years. So if you're a parent who grew up prior to that hardening, you know, you might have a slightly, particularly if you're Democrat, because there were Democrats in Congress that opposed abortion 40 years ago. You know, so if that was your generation, you could have been a Democrat and opposed abortion, but your kids aren't growing up in that world. And if your kids say, I could never be a Republican because I've seen how much they hate, you know, LGBTQ people, and I've seen how they like wars, and, you know, they don't care about the environment, so I could never be a Republican, so I'm going to be a Democrat. And today, that means, among other things, that you're in favor of total access to abortion.
Yeah, and there's been some data that shows since the overturning of Roe last year, the number of Democrats who are open to what you might label common sense restrictions on abortion has gone down. Like the whole party has moved much more toward the direction of unrestricted abortion in response to Dobbs' decision. So time will tell again as the data comes out, but I'm not convinced that the Dobbs decision long-term is a win for the pro-life movement the way a lot of people have been celebrating it to be. But we'll see.
Yeah, I applauded sending the decisions back to the states and getting rid of the viability line, because it made America more pro-abortion than Scandinavia, you know, which is just insane to think about. Most of Europe, we were more liberal on abortion than most of Europe. But the pushback was always, yes, but in Europe, they have a better safety net for women. So there's more support. There's easy access to health care. So abortion doesn't become the way out, you know, of a decision that you didn't think you had a chance to make. You know, you have much more government support, and we've generally opposed that on ideological grounds in the U.S. If you're a conservative, you oppose government support, and we've convinced ourselves that government support makes people irresponsible and creates crime and all sorts of things that we blame on government support without a whole heck of a lot of data to back it up. So, Jamie, what can we do? Oh, boy.
Well, I was going to ask you guys, what do we do? Like, if you said earlier that was not at the exit polls, that was not the number one reason for people voting. It was immigration, which I've never heard that before, and I was very surprised by that. So if that's not the number one reason that people were voting like a single ticket party, whatever, what happens in 2024? Is abortion still a major conversation? It feels like it is.
Yeah. It is on the left. That's for sure.
It is on the left.
Right.
I think it's on the left more than on the right now.
Okay.
And that's another part of the concern that we raised a year ago is what does the backlash do? And is the backlash more damaging to a pro-life cause than continued incremental improvements to the status quo would have been, and it was that kind of being fed up with incrementalism that said, we just need to put people in the White House and people in Congress that will just ban it outright, which is not going to happen. That's clear. It's not going to happen.
Basically, the bottom line here is, had people listened to you guys a year ago, we might not be where we are now.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Thanks,
The
Jamie.
Holy Post is
Yeah. No one will
the
grab
answer to
that.
everything.
No one will grab that clip and put it on social media. Okay. Jamie, where can people go if they want to hang out with you more?
I'm not on Twitter or X or whatever it is now. That place makes me have like sweaty armpits. I could never hang out there.
We don't want you to have
People are
sweaty
just
armpits,
mad.
Jamie.
No, I like Instagram. Jamie Ivey. You can find me over there. It's fun.
Okay.
That's where I like to hang out.
Okay. And your podcast is?
Oh yeah, my podcast is The Happy Hour, which you guys have both been on, and so
That's right.
I love yes, you guys have both been on. It's fun conversations about faith and life and things that are happening in the world, and I think it's a happy place to be.
Would
Do you ever get criticized for the happy hour kind of sounding like a drinking thing?
I don't. Like one of the funniest things Dr. Moore ever said to me when he was on the show, he's like, "Well, I'm so happy to be here. This is like the first happy hour I've ever been to." And I was like, "Oh, Russell." No, I don't. I don't really run in that kind of really legalistic crowd. So I'm done with that.
Demographic. Would you say that when
not.
Skye, the episodes that Skye and I were on, would you say that those were probably the happiest of all your hours?
Probably the happiest, most listened. I left just most informed and just felt like I had a pep in my step after them.
That's fantastic.
I love having you guys on.
That's fantastic. All right. Thanks for sitting in, Jamie Ivey. Check out her podcasts and all the other fun stuff she does out of that little blue dot in that giant Red Sea down south. And we got a great guest. Hang out, and we'll be back next week. Bye. This episode is sponsored in part by World Relief, the humanitarian organization we trust to tackle the challenges at the southern border and around the world. This month, as we raise awareness about refugees, you'll hear about our recent trip to the U.S. southern border with World Relief, where we learned more about how they're serving refugees and other immigrants together with volunteers, local churches, and other partners. We hope you'll be challenged by what you hear, and that those of you with kids in your lives will bring them along in understanding how we can love and serve our refugee neighbors with the compassion of Jesus. For a limited time, World Relief is providing a Welcoming Refugees Family Guide that can help you dive into deeper discussions on the topic of immigration and refugees with your family. Download your guide today at worldrelief.org/holypost. As you lean into how you and your loved ones can walk alongside refugee and immigrant neighbors, I encourage you to consider partnering with World Relief through their monthly giving community that you've heard us talk about before, called The Path. Visit worldrelief.org/holypost to learn more today. That's worldrelief.org/holypost. And thanks to World Relief for sponsoring this episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones? I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode.
There is no question that politics, and especially partisan politics, is deeply forming the identity and views of many Americans, and that includes Christians. Part of the reason is that many churches and Christian communities narrowly define which issues God cares about, and they often neglect addressing any others. immigration is a vivid example. Despite being a dominant theme throughout the Bible, both in narratives and commandments, many Christians have no idea what Scripture says about it. Unfortunately, that vacuum is usually filled by political slogans and policies rather than good theology and Christian values. Today's guest is a Bible scholar who's trying to correct that mistake. Daniel Carroll is a professor of biblical studies and pedagogy at Wheaton College. He previously taught for many years at a seminary in Guatemala City and then at Denver Seminary. He's the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including The Bible and Borders: Hearing God's Word on Immigration. As you'll hear in our conversation, Dr. Carroll isn't primarily interested in debating specific immigration policies. Instead, he wants to see Christians formed by the vision of immigrants we find in Scripture. Once that foundation is set, only then can we have a fruitful discussion about how to fix the problems with the immigration system in the U.S. Here's my conversation with Dr. Daniel Carroll. Dr. Carroll, welcome to the Holy Post.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're local right here in Wheaton, aren't you?
I am here in Wheaton. Yeah, I'm in my office at the college.
Well, I'm a few blocks from you. We could have probably done this in person than fight with the technical issues this morning. But thank you for your time. I want to begin just by asking you to fill me in more on how you came into this topic. Why is immigration and its intersection with Scripture relevant to you?
Well, there's actually a personal story there. I'm half Guatemalan, so I grew up bilingual and bicultural. And so, long story short, I spent time in Latin America growing up during the summers, and then I went and taught in Latin America in Guatemala for 13 years before coming to the U.S. And when I came back to the U.S., this was now a hot topic. And when I was growing up, we never processed it. My mother was Guatemalan, and we just never processed any of that stuff. My grandmother would come up, once a year. Our neighbors for 11 years were my Guatemalan aunt and uncle. Never processed it. So I come back to the U.S., and now it's a political issue, and I'm listening to it and wondering what to do with it. And what I found, I'm going back now about 15 or 16 years. That's how long I've been working on this stuff. There was almost nothing at all about the Bible and immigration. And there was a book from the UK and maybe an article you could find. Now it's all over the place. So I thought, well, what does the Bible say? And I didn't know. And so that's how I got into it. And it had this personal piece to it, too. So I started going to a Latino church in Denver, got involved with Latino Pastors Association in Denver. And so now it became more personal because these were people that I knew. We started a Spanish-speaking program at the seminary where I was in Denver. And so probably about 95% of them were undocumented. The church I went to probably is about the same. And so, as we would say in Spanish, "Esta es mi gente." These are my people. And so that's the personal piece to it, and then just the idea that what I could contribute to the ongoing discussion was the biblical piece, because a lot of Christians who are involved don't know why. They have kind of a compassionate impulse. But if you ask them, how can you defend this theologically or biblically, they could probably give you a couple of verses, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And the same on the other side. I mean, so on the other side, who would be anti-immigrant, they'd probably have Romans 13 or something like that. So my slice of it was trying to educate the church as best I could with biblical stuff. So that's kind of how I got into it, and I still, of course, work on it.
Yeah, let's talk about the Bible side of this. In conversations that I've encountered around this, where Christians are talking and they try to reference the Bible, you already mentioned it, those who seem opposed to immigration, especially those coming in without documentation, they often will cite Romans 13, obey the governing authorities. On the flip side, those who want to extend a sense of compassion and understanding to those who are entering the country, they will often cite Leviticus and, do not mistreat the sojourner / immigrant / alien, whatever translation you use among you. And that's about as far as it goes.
Right.
So I was encouraged by your book, The Bible and Borders, because you give a very robust engagement of this topic. And you begin in Genesis 1 and the image of God. Explain why you see that as the origin, the place to begin on this whole topic.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things if I could. One is migration is the stuff of history. The history of the world is the history of migration in any country in the world. So we would expect to find migration in the Bible, which indeed we do. And it permeates both testaments, and maybe we'll get into it a bit later. But on one side, when people do the Romans 13 thing, I can appreciate it. I really do. But they don't really know what U.S. law is or the history of U.S. law. And I could, push them on some of that kind of stuff. But what I tell people is, Romans 13 in my Bible is about page 1,000. Why don't we go to Why don't we go to page 1? And you've got to get to Romans 13. So you don't want to shirk the legislation discussion, because eventually, like we're seeing today, you've got to get to legislation.
Right.
But the thing is, what are the values and what are the commitments that would guide our discussions about legislation? And so that's where I go to Genesis 1 in the image of God. And that's why I begin there. And that changes the tone. And let me give you a quick example. A recurring issue in this country, I actually have a student here, is DACA.
Mm-hmm.
These are the young people that came over with their parents. This one young lady has been here since she was 3. She's from California. So when you look at the image of God in Genesis 1, it's about the value of every human being. Got that. But it also says that we are enabled and called to rule and subdue the earth. Now you're talking about human potential. Okay? All our gifts. And so what I say with the DACA discussion, one way of looking at the image of God and how it applies to DACA is, how do we facilitate all the potential and the gifts of hundreds of thousands of young people that are here because their parents brought them? Now the idea is doing legislation to facilitate this for the national good versus beginning with legislation that by definition must be punitive. You've changed the tone, you've changed the purpose of legislation because of where you begin the discussion. So that's why I go to Genesis 1, because that'll determine the rest of the discussion, I think.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit. I used to work with Andy Crouch. He and I were colleagues at CT, and he would often talk about how for many of us, functionally, the Bible begins in Genesis 3 with the fall and with the sinfulness of humanity. And if you begin in Genesis 3, even forget Romans 13, if you begin in Genesis 3 with we are sinners and we violate God's expectations, and you bring that framework to the question of people entering the country without documentation, then you go to the punitive response. Whereas again, if you begin in Genesis 1, as you're saying, with human potential and made in the image of God and human dignity, you ask different questions of those who are entering the country and come up perhaps with a different response. You go on in the book to talk about the many stories in Genesis and then throughout the Old Testament of immigrants.
Yep.
Some of them refugees who are fleeing in some way, either famine or persecution. Others uprooted against their will and taken.
Yep.
Joseph being trafficked by his brothers to Egypt, the exile of God's people into Babylon. And there are others who are willing immigrants. Explain what, there's so many of those stories, we can't get into all of them, but what are some values that you think Scripture is trying to communicate to us about immigrants and immigration that we need to think about today?
That's a great question. I think I'm an Old Testament prof, okay, here at Wheaton College, but one of the beautiful things about the Old Testament in particular are the stories, because they are so true to life. They're hungry. Abram, in Genesis 12, they go to Egypt because they're hungry, and it's a famine, or they're, other stories are fleeing war and things. And so what you're seeing is the human face of migration in the Bible itself, and these are the people of God. So I think what the Old Testament can do is help us put a human face on this. Now, you just told me before we came on that you were in Tijuana.
Mm-hmm.
Well, part of why people do a border visit is to put a human face on it. Because oftentimes what happens is it's just kind of an abstract idea. That
Right.
was one of the things that really hit me once I began, and I do the same thing here in Wheaton. I attend a Latino church. Once you begin to be with these people, and of course, as I said, I'm half Guatemalan, so son mi gente, these are my people. It changes the discussion because they're little kids, they're
Hmm.
teenagers, they're mom and dads, doing all kinds of work. So the Old Testament puts a human face on it. And I think that's the most important thing. And the other thing that I would say, and again, we might get into more of this, is that when you move into the Old Testament law, the law is very explicit about taking care of the foreigner
Right.
because they're vulnerable. And it lumps them together with widows and orphans and the poor. So what you find in the Old Testament, in a sense, is that how you treat vulnerable people is a reflection of your faith itself. And in the Old Testament, of course, they had been immigrants, forced in some cases, in other cases not, but they were exploited in Egypt. They knew what it was like to be an exploited foreigner. They knew what it was like to migrate then into Canaan. I mean, this was the story, this was their history, and which continues with the Jewish people even today, of course, with the tragic things going on in the Middle East. So what you find is not only is it a human face, what you find in the Old Testament, it actually becomes uh, a way to evaluate your faith and how well you know the heart of God. Let me give you a quick passage, then I'll turn it back to you. In Deuteronomy 10, which I think is a key passage, 17 and 19, it says, God doesn't show any favorites, and he loves the foreigner. And then he says, and you shall love them too. So when people, sometimes will say, well, why do I need to do this? And my answer to them is, well, because God loves them. I can't give you a better answer than that. And because God loves vulnerable people, and you and I, who are Christians and have come to faith, you would tell me a story of woe about how you became a Christian. Something happened in your life, uh, as it did for me when I was in college, and we were vulnerable. It may have been kind of an existential vulnerability. But what you have are also economic and social and political and racial vulnerabilities in this world. And so God loves vulnerable people. He reaches out to them. He redeems them. And so I think it's a way of expressing the heart of God in our attitudes and in our actions.
That's really helpful because it seems like a lot of the rhetoric that you hear in the political discourse around this has shifted immigrants from the category of vulnerable people and moved them into the category of threatening people. They're here to take our jobs. They're here to take over our country, to change our culture. In some extreme cases, politicians and news media will even refer to them as invaders.
Right.
And when you move them into that category, these biblical commands about compassion and care and loving the vulnerable because the Lord does, it all falls away. What do you say to those Christians who are marinating in those voices that are elevating their fear
Yep.
and categorizing immigrants as a threat rather than as an opportunity?
Well, it's easy to be overly negative about them. But if you go to Exodus chapter 1, the very first few verses, the Egyptians are scared. They're scared of the numbers of the Israelites. So what I would say, and you'll see this in the book of Daniel, where some of the people in the royal court don't like him, and they actually plot against him.
Right.
So I think the fear and the suspicion of foreigners is natural. So I don't condemn them for that. Oftentimes they don't know any immigrants, but the idea of a fear is a very natural human response. So I'm actually not bothered with that. Um, and when I speak to people of all kinds, the other thing that I would say is sometimes those fears need to be voiced, and sometimes there is an element of truth to this. You see, so let me give you two examples. So as someone who believes in the Bible and that we are all sinners in the sight of God, there's going to be a certain percentage of immigrants that are going to be bad people. They are. I don't need to defend them. But there's a a certain percentage of native-born Americans who are bad people. So when you defend America, you're not defending those people. Okay? So one of the things that happens sometimes with immigrant advocates is that they idealize the immigrant.
Mm.
And if you actually work with them, they have family issues, raising their kids and issues of honesty, just like all of us do. And so I don't idealize immigrants, and I can say, you know what, you need, it's okay to be a bit fearful, and sometimes there are some bad immigrants, and we're seeing this now with the Middle East. That I was watching an interview with the Senate last night. The FBI is tracking the influx of potential terrorists through the southern border. That's a real issue. So part of our problem is no one wants to admit the complexity.
Right.
So on the welcoming side, they don't want to admit, well, some bad people do come over. Well, we need to admit it. On the other side, instead of making all of them bad people, realize that it's just a small percentage. I would call this the Haman effect, you see. So in the book of Esther, he doesn't like what Mordecai is doing. And so his response is, well, kill them all. It's the Haman effect, right? Mm-hmm. One bad one in his mind means they're all bad, okay? That's what you see in the history of the world and in the history of the country when it comes to migration. There will be a certain sector of the population that will find the bad one, and then they'll generalize the whole population. This has been a recurring issue. We saw it in this country with the Irish and the Italians. And so this is, that fear and that kind of labeling, we've been doing this for 250 years.
Yeah, there is a long history of it, and you're right. It is our human nature to fear the other.
Yeah.
One of the common arguments that I think is gaining in volume, especially from sort of the Christian nationalist side of things, is they will admit Scripture calls us to love and care for the immigrant and human dignity, image of God, all of that. But they will argue there is also a good virtue in the protection of one's indigenous culture. And therefore, to allow the number of immigrants that are coming into this country to continue is a threat to the indigenous American culture. And it is a good, righteous thing to limit that severely, even in order to maintain and protect your own people, the kinism kind of idea. Mm-hmm. What does Scripture have to say about that? Especially given, you're an Old Testament scholar. There's a lot in the Old Testament about God's people protecting themselves and distancing themselves from the practices and customs of the cultures around them. Does that have any relevance in this conversation, or is that a misappropriation of Old Testament language?
I think it's a misappropriation. It's also bad history.
Yes.
There was actually a party in the 19th century in this country called the Know Nothing Party.
Right.
And this country was primarily Protestant. So the big fear was letting Catholics into the country. So that meant the Italians and the Irish, because they didn't want the country to change its Protestant heritage. And so actually was in the mid-19th century, there actually was a presidential candidate of the Know Nothing Party. So the idea that culture is stagnant is bad history. Let me give an example, and then let me just say something more biblical. So when people say, we need to protect American culture, so I go, okay, so do you mean kind of the Bronx?
Yeah. Which American culture? Yeah.
Yeah, or do you mean kind of Idaho farmers or Cajun New Orleans or kind of SoCal, man? What American culture are you talking about?
Right.
So whether it's our food or our sports like soccer, right? Fútbol in Spanish, that is taking the country by storm. Oh my gosh, that's an import. I remember when it started, we were in Denver at the time, and I remember hearing, soccer will never take off in this country. This is a football country, right? Well, look what's happened. Our culture is absorbing. It's one of the beauties of American culture, actually, that we absorb the food, the sports, the language, all these things. That's part of the beauty of it. The other thing that I would say, this more on the New Testament side, that is that this confusion of Christian faith and the nation, which actually is as old as time. It's not limited to Christians, actually. But that's not a Christian conversation. What is the duty and the mission of the people of God is not the same thing as what should the U.S. government do. Those are two different discussions. And what happens is that those get conflated, and that's where you get the wedding of church and state, when it's very clear, even with Jesus, given to Caesar what is Caesar's, but, to the Lord what is the Lord's. And our mission is not the mission of the U.S. government. And so we need to begin to divide those conversations, but a lot of people will mix them to our harm, as we're seeing the last few years.
Okay, let's turn a little bit more towards the Romans 13 legal obedience to the government kind of stuff, because that's another common argument that I'm hearing coming from the more anti-immigrant side of things. So there's a gross analogy that's come up where someone will say, especially in the New Testament, the commands toward hospitality that we get from Romans and Hebrews. If someone knocks on my front door and asks to come in or wants me, that's one thing, because that empowers me to say yes or no, to be hospitable or to not be hospitable. If that person breaks into my house, that's a violation of the law, and I am not expected to be hospitable to them. Some people take that metaphor and apply it to the country as a whole. If you come to a port of entry and request entry to the United States, that's an opportunity for the United States to either say yes or no, to be hospitable or not, maybe a place for our law to be compassionate or not. But if you enter the country illegally in an undocumented fashion, that's no different than breaking into a house, and there's no need to be compassionate and understanding. You're just frankly violating the law and should be treated as a criminal. Why is that I know it's wrong, but why is that metaphor what does it fail to grasp about the situation, whether in reality or in a theological sense?
Well, again, I think most people, when they talk about this, don't understand why people are coming in undocumented, and why is it that U.S. law cannot handle it. That's another discussion. And normally when I talk to people, they don't understand U.S. law.
Right.
They don't understand why we have these different categories. So part of it is the law itself won't, the way it's framed today, won't allow for larger numbers, which we actually need. Let me give you one example, and then let me move back to another point. The U.S. immigration system works on a quota system. Most people don't understand this. They just kind of do the border thing because that's what the media gives them. But there are actually certain kinds of visas that people can apply for to come in an authorized fashion. Now, we need probably about 500,000 undocumented work visas every year. And because if you look around, for instance, who are the people doing construction and all these things? Well, oftentimes they're undocumented. We need the labor, and our population actually, especially among whites, is shrinking. Okay, so we need it. But so we think that we need about 500,000 visas for unskilled labor. The national quota annually is between 5,000 and 10,000. You can just see it's a totally ridiculous kind of quota system. What you need to do is to work the quotas, but because it's such a political, hot button, no one even dares to touch the numbers, which generates more people coming unauthorized.
If I can interrupt you there, for a second to illustrate this, when I was at Tijuana, or actually in San Diego on the other side of the border, we met with a border agent, somebody who is guarding the wall literally and apprehending people that come in. And I asked him, or one of us asked him, what do you think is most broken about the system that needs to be fixed? And he said exactly what you just said, is we need a lot more work visas for people, because they're coming in because we want them here to work, especially agricultural jobs. And there's no legal way for them to come in, even though we want them here. And so therefore we create a system that makes their activity illegal unnecessarily. So there's a border agent who agrees with you that we need to drastically expand the number of work visas that we allow.
Yeah, and at the same time, and this is could derail the conversation, but part of the problem is that the last couple of administrations make the problem worse in all different kinds of ways. So we're actually generating more. And so the pragmatic question of how we manage the border is a very real issue. And I don't minimize that. And I think this administration, just like the last one in a very different way, is mishandling it, which makes everything worse. And then the media don't help. So I would grant those who are concerned that it's a total pragmatic mess. I mean, we see it here in Chicago, as you would know, you're in Wheaton. Those are those, those are pragmatic discussions that people need to get to. But I would go back again to saying, don't conflate U.S. border policy with Christian mission. You may disagree with what the government is doing, whatever side of the equation you're on, but it doesn't take away the mission and the obligation to care for vulnerable people once they come in. That is the role of the church. And we can have our political discussions and we can talk to our Congress people and all this kind of stuff. That's not Christian mission. And we need to begin to separate U.S. immigration policy from Christian mission. It's a different discussion. But because our religion, left and right, I would say, is so compromised by our ideologies, we cannot see it. And that's part of our problem. So I get what they're saying. I think a lot of what they're saying has value. I think they're right in many ways. But that's a different kind of discussion than what I am obligated to do as a believer in Jesus.
Yeah, that became very evident while we were in San Diego, as well as we talked to some church leaders whose congregations were mobilized and trying to help the situation and those seeking asylum in the U.S. especially. They had difficulty sometimes getting other churches in the area on board with this work because they were interpreting the problem through a political lens primarily rather than a mission lens or a biblical lens. Before we go, we haven't really talked much New Testament and the Gospels.
We haven't talked about the Old Testament really hardly.
I know. We can't get into the nitty gritty in the time that's allowed. But what in the time we have remaining, what have we not touched on biblically? Pick your testament that you think our audience should really grapple with, even if it's just to introduce the concept.
I think if you just go to the Old Testament stories, it's all over the place. And since our time is short, here's a thought. And when I speak to Latino congregations, I actually will mention this. If you go to like 1 Peter, there's several other passages, but this is an easy one. If you go to 1 Peter, chapters 1 and 2, what Peter will do, he'll use migration as a metaphor for the Christian faith. We are strangers in a strange land. Our problem is we're so committed to this place, it's no longer strange. And actually, we want to defend it and keep the strangers out. I mean, we've totally flipped the thing. But migration is so central to the identity of the people of God that it is a metaphor for what it means to be a Christian. We are strangers with a different king, a different set of values, different motivations and mission than the world in which we live. We are strangers in a strange land. And this country is getting stranger all the time.
Amen.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, but here's the point. And I've actually heard Latino pastors will say this. And I go to a Latino church, and you would hear an amen. On the one hand, they see their obligation as the mission of a Latino church to be a blessing to the United States. They really do. On the other hand, what I would say to my non-immigrant brothers and sisters, immigrants know what it means to be strange, whether it's the language, their accent, the way they dress, the way they do family, the food they eat, the sports they like, etc., etc., etc. And we could learn about what it means to be a Christian by getting to know Christian immigrants. They know what it means to be strange.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say that begin to process the Old Testament stories, I would say, because a lot of what those Old Testament people are going through is what we see today. But the other piece would be process what it means to be a stranger. How does that connect me to the immigrant church? And now there are millions of immigrant Christians in this country, millions of undocumented Christians. And here's the point. Every major denomination in this country is holding its numbers because of immigrant churches. Okay? And now we have millions. God in his grace has brought us millions of believers from overseas. And now you begin to have a different kind of conversation. They are now part of our church in the big C, and God is using them to bless this country, and God is actually holding the church steady with foreign believers. You're changing the conversation by changing the topic of discussion. So those would be some very quick kind of things.
I'm glad you mentioned that because at the beginning we talked about Genesis 1 and beginning this conversation about immigrants recognizing their dignity and humanity as those created in the image of God. But you just added a different component to this, which is they're not merely made in the image of God, but many of them are our sisters and brothers in Christ.
Yes, millions of them.
Right. So that should also factor in to our thinking in response to this incredibly complicated issue. Dr. Carroll, thank you for your time this morning. Thanks for the book. Again, it's The Bible and Borders. You wrote it a couple of years ago. I mean, like you said, it's a topic you've been engaging for 15 or 20 years now. But as somebody who's also the son of an immigrant, and my mother is an Anglo-U.S. American, my father's from India, I've been around immigrants my whole life. It's a complicated reality, and it has been strange to watch the conversation change, because when I was a kid and even as a teenager and college student, this was not a hot political potato. No one was really upset about it. And all of a sudden, for me, I noticed it after 9/11. And since then, it has taken on different gravity and partisanship in a way that is disturbing. But I'm grateful for your work because it's a reminder that we need to begin with Scripture and not with our politics. Hope to have you back. You're local. We should talk about this more. I hope we can do this in person sometime. Okay. Thank you again.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.